A new update to Lord of the Rings Rise to War has completely reworked faction bonuses. Today I'm going to talk about how to activate the new faction bonuses and my opinion on which ones I think are good and which ones I think are bad. Let's dive in. Alright, the first big change is that faction bonuses are no longer passively obtained at the very beginning of any new season. Now they are tied to your ring, and my face is kind of hiding where they are. You'll notice a new ring skill in the bottom right-hand side of the tree, and this is a unique skill for each faction. I'm Arnor this season, so mine increases EXP from battles by 10%. Do note that in order to skill this skill, it requires 2 skill points. Obviously, most of the ring skills, actually all of the other ring skills, are 1 point per little tick of the skill. This is just straight up 2 points to obtain the skill, and your ring has to be at least level 30. And one of the things I'll talk about is which of these skills I think you should take right away as soon as you can, and which of the new faction bonuses maybe you wait until later to invest those points, because early on, right when your ring hits level 30, 2 points is actually almost like 10% of the points that you have available, so relatively costly in the very beginning stages of the game. Alright, so we'll just go through these one by one and quickly talk about all of them. Please note that the top bonus here is the old faction bonus, and then the bottom part is the new faction bonus. So for Rohan, they went from a 3% increased march speed to 50% increased reposition speed. For anybody that doesn't know, reposition speed is how quickly you move like from your city to a fort, your city to a fortress, things like that. Overall, I would say this is pretty weak. It's a nice quality of life change, because if you're trying to send an army all the way across the map, they're going to get there faster. However, in terms of actual PvP, this will probably very rarely make a huge difference. I suppose if somehow you get surprise attacked by somebody that you thought was an ally, or one of your enemies surprises you, your faction will be able to get armies to the front quicker. But overall, in my opinion, not a very good skill. I would not recommend taking this in the very beginning of the game. You're not going to be doing much repositioning. You're just going to want to farm as much as possible. And instead, those 2 ring points could go into extra damage to PvE armies or extra EXP, things like that. Moving on to Gondor, we go from minus 5% construction time, which was one of the worst skills in the game, to organizational efficiency, stone and ore gathering plus 10%. This one's pretty decent. You need a ton of stone in the beginning of the game in order to build all of your buildings. So right away, early on, as soon as you get a 150 tile, and in my opinion, your first 150 should be a stone 150. You're going to be gathering on that thing like crazy. So this is going to be a nice little economy boost in the early game. And towards the later stages of the game, once your market is fully upgraded, you could gather stone and then trade it for something else. So maybe as Gondor, you'll want to aim for a 300 power stone or ore tile and gather on that. Obviously, gathering, like let's say you want grain, gathering on a 300 power grain tile is still going to be better than having 10% extra on a stone tile and then losing 20%, because that's how much you lose with a maxed out market. But pretty decent overall. I would say it's not the best in the game, but it's certainly not shabby. I would take this one early on because you're going to gather a bunch early on. Lothlorien goes from Commander EXP 5%, which is one of the absolute best in the game, to Wounded Units Recovery Rate plus 10%. This is a pretty nice little quality of life change, especially once PvP starts happening, because that means you get to clear out your apothecary, I should say, more quickly. And also, if you're going to be boosting through your apothecary, you're going to save yourself on boosts. Overall, this is pretty good. I would not recommend taking this early on in the season, because you're just not going to be filling up your apothecary unless you're PvPing on like day 3. However, once you start farming 200s or once PvP happens, I think this is definitely worth those 2 points, and overall pretty solid. Mordor goes from 5% resource production to max ability points plus 20%. I have to say, so far in this, we haven't like tested everything out, but just theoretically, I think this is now By far the best faction bonus in the game. Max ability points plus 20% is at least 6 extra ability points. So you start with 20. Pretty early on, you're going to get plus 10 from your ring. That's 30. 20% of 30 is an extra 6. I assume that this will count those like extra 10 that you get from the ring. Even if it doesn't, that's still plus 4. And since ability points always, your maximum number of ability points always recharges every 24 hours, the more ability points you have, the faster they come back. The faster they come back, the more you can quick march, long march, gather, mind sharpen, all of the super nice abilities that are tied to those ability points. You just get to do them more often. And if this does take into account things like Argonath's bonus or Karas Galadhan's bonus ability points, this 20% could add up pretty quickly to a whole bunch of extra ability points. You're just going to be swimming in these things, quick marching everywhere, gathering 24/7, mind sharpening everybody you want to. Super powerful ability. I would 100% take this as soon as possible. Isengard, conscription cost minus 10% turns into conscription cost minus 10% and barracks capacity plus 10%. This, in my opinion, is basically exactly the same because as far as PvP goes in this game, you're really bottlenecked by your apothecary unless you're comfortable with boosting through your apothecary constantly, which some people are. If you have the gems to do it, go for it. However, at max barracks capacity, you're going to fill your apothecary before you're anywhere near clearing out your entire barracks. So for super whales, this might be a pretty solid bonus. For most players, I think it's probably not going to come into play. However, the conscription cost was already a pretty powerful bonus in and of itself, especially in the early game, because you want as many troops as possible early on to constantly be farming and flipping tiles. When you're paying 10% less, that means you can get more units for the same amount of resources that other factions pay. So this was already pretty darn good, and it's still pretty darn good. Erebor goes from conscription time minus 5% to dwarven unit conscription time minus 10%. This I have a little bit of mixed feelings about. I think it's overall a nerf, as having 5% less conscription time on things like cataphracts, bone knights, cavaliers, those really long conscription time units. Shaving extra minutes off of that can be pretty impactful. However, this does mean that Erebor's tier 4s will be recruited slightly quicker than they were before this change. I think for the early game for Erebor, this is fantastic because obviously you're just going to be using dwarven units anyway. Cranking out more units is just a good thing because units are frequently a bottleneck early on in seasons. And if you're one of the guys that just loves to play Erebor constantly, uses all those awesome Dwarven commanders, and always wants to be running Dwarven units, for you, this is probably a nice little buff. But if you're going to be running like Theoden, Gandalf the White, Gil-galad, those type of commanders as Erebor, technically it's a slight nerf. However, not that big of a deal. It's still a reasonable ring skill, and it is one that I would take right away. And Isengard, I would also take that one right away as well. Rhun goes from against non-player armies, damage dealt plus 10%, which was fantastic, to Walker of the Sands, damage plus 12% when battling on desert lands. In the early game, this is a very marginally better buff since you're going to be starting in the desert. However, in the mid and late game, hopefully you're PvPing around Dol Guldur, and there are not deserts there, which means at that point, your faction buff is completely irrelevant. So this is kind of one of the weaker ones now, I think, and whether or not you take it right away will just completely depend upon where are you farming. If you're still farming in the desert, go ahead and take it. If you're kind of past that point, then I wouldn't worry about it. Angmar goes from extra siege damage to soldiers' death rate minus 5%, on top of the current death rate, wounded soldiers plus. It's a very interesting tooltip. What I believe that it means is in normal circumstances, if you take 1,000 casualties, let's just say, so dead and wounded, well, I should just say 1,000 casualties blanket. 40% of those will actually become wounded units after the first 24 hours. And then 60% are going to be just dead and gone. So for normal factions, if you have 1,000 total casualties on your battle report, you're going to see 400 wounded, 600 dead. I think what this is doing for Angmar is you do 45% wounded and then 55% dead. So you are actually saving yourself 5% fully dead troops, which is pretty powerful, especially come PvP time. However, that does mean that your apothecary is going to fill faster. Overall, I think this is quite a solid skill. I don't think that I would take it early game because you're probably not going to be taking that many casualties on 130s and 150s. However, like Lothloriens, once you get into farming 200 plus tiles or when it's PvP time, I would definitely take it. For Lindon, we have wood and grain gathering plus 10% is changed to wood and grain extracted plus 15%. This gets my winner for probably the worst skill in the game now. I would never, ever take this until I have absolutely no other points to spend on my ring because extraction is terrible. You should always be gathering, pretty much always, 99.9% of the time. You should be gathering instead of extracting, especially because you can only take this skill after you've unlocked the ability to gather anyway. So if you're going to get more resources from gathering than you would from extracting, why would you be extracting? Unless it's like a super emergency situation, you're just going to want to gather because it's more efficient. By the time your ring is level 30, you're not going to be extracting anymore. So this is terrible. Don't take it. Arnor goes from construction cost minus 5%, which was super bad, to Battle Scholar EXP gained from battles plus 10%. This is a phenomenal faction bonus, and in my opinion, it's in the running for the best good side faction bonus now. And that's because I'm a huge proponent of EXP buffs in this game. The faster you level your commanders, the earlier you can start farming 200 power tiles, the earlier you can start grinding on crossings and ruins and mob camps to level up, and that just snowballs. Technically, by the time the late game rolls around and everybody has all the level 50 commanders that they want, this is effectively just void at that point. However, the amount of snowball that you can gain by leveling faster than other people in this game cannot be understated, especially because it takes so much freaking experience to get a commander from technically now level 5 to level 50. I was going to say 1 to 50, but absolutely fantastic bonus. Definitely 100% of the time, take this as soon as possible. Gundabad goes from storage limit plus 10% to resource trade plus 10%. This is a fantastic bonus as well. You can have, I think, like a 90% efficient market as Gundabad now. Maybe it's 80%. I'd have to go back and check. Either way, the market in this game, once you have it maxed out, is such a powerful effect. If you're like me, you're going to be trading resources constantly, and this makes it even more efficient. Great for the early game, great for the mid game, great for the late game. Definitely take this right away 100% of the time. Faction trait for Varag goes from EXP and resources gained by sweeping plus 15% to EXP and resources gained, and I guess this is one word now, resource gained by sweeping plus 25%. This is simply a buff to an already powerful faction ability. The amount of grain that you can crank out in the early game from sweeping is very substantial. I would recommend that everybody should be sweeping in the early game with their extra commanders because you can get so much extra grain from that. As Varyags, this means that you can level even your primary commanders off of sweeping and be gaining more grain on top of that. If you have too much grain, which is probably never a problem for anybody, you can always just trade it for whatever resource you need from the market, since we're just talking about how powerful the market is anyway. Definitely a great faction bonus and one that I would take right away as well. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.